Okay, so tell me a little bit about yourself and what your experiences were like as a college student with disabilities.
Hi, I graduated from undergrad in May of 2021, and then I went to graduate school at a different university, which recently I've had to withdraw from due to barriers like ableism and related to other factors of my identity. But so my experience as a college student with disabilities was really interesting because I've always had a diagnosis, but I didn't really recognize it as a something that in like something that um I thought could be qualified as a disability until I came to college when school actually started to become really, really challenging, and I sort of shut down. I knew I likely was misdiagnosed with just a sensory disability when I was younger. So I went to get that reevaluated, and it turns out I was diagnosed with a neurodivergent spectrum disorder. So, and from there, the university eventually got involved. I was at the University of Illinois. They eventually had gotten involved just on the basis of checking on how I was doing. And I connected with the dean at the Office of the Dean of Students, who then was like, you can get support through disability services with your situation. I didn't know what disability services was at all. And so from then she connected me to disability services, and I um, fell headfirst into the disability world and the disability community. Thankfully, Illinois is one of the best campuses for students with disabilities. It's already fully physically accessible. Some of the buildings are a little bit challenging. I've known friends getting stuck in elevators before, but I would say overall, in terms of physical accessibility, it's pretty good. In terms of accessibility for people who have like non-apparent disabilities, it is a little bit more challenging having to navigate systems with professors and services, but I would say that like being registered with the disability services in my undergrad was pinnacle to my development as a disability advocate and as a student. So after being registered, I got accommodations. After I had my documentation, I got accommodations, and that changed the game for me. I was able to go in and take exams without sensory overload. I was able to take them in separate rooms, had flexible attendance, which I know is a high stakes accommodation now. And those things really helped lessen the burden that school put on me, in addition to fatigue related to disability.
Mhm.
So like people don't realize how tiring it gets having to, you know, not only just do the executive function in the morning of getting up, getting ready and going, and then when you get to class, you're exhausted and can't really pay attention very well because you're exhausted, and then you have to go home and expect to do homework. And so for me, like, it was just that
Mhm.
exhaustion that really, really got to me. Like, and then that, you know, made things a bit more challenging. When I got to graduate school, it was a whole different story. It was a different campus, and I think I took everything at Illinois for granted, because when I got to Michigan, it was a lot more challenging. I had some personal stuff going on, but the in my program, which was the higher education program, um it I found that I was doing a lot of the educating in terms of like disability related stuff than learning about it, like
Mhm.
universal design for learning, and what an ADA based design, like in terms of like architectural design and structures, and what those structures can symbolically mean for people with disabilities. Like every entrance to this program's, like the building that this program is in, every entrance is a staircase, except I think like two or three that are like loading zones, and then an
Mhm.
elevator that's shared between two buildings. It's like, how does that make someone with disabilities feel when it's like accessibility wasn't like on really on their mind, and after, like, in terms of architecture. And so that I should have noticed that when I visited, but I think I was enamored by the allure of everything. And so yeah, with graduate school it was hard. I worked in internship and had disclosed my disability at the beginning, and I thought that I was going into a space that cared about diversity, equity, and inclusion, including disabilities. But that wasn't really the case. There were words said when I requested accommodations, um like if, what is it, if oh, in our job description we wanted someone who could work semi-autonomously, and it seems like you need everything spelled out to you. And I was only asking for like 15 more minutes with my supervisor.
Mhm.
Uh, so that was really challenging. There was other ones, like my supervisor saying, I looked up your disability online yesterday. And like for spectrum disorders, especially, it's like the representation, especially for like women with spectrum disorders, it's like it's not really there in showing like of symptomology and everything. And then later on, the supervisor was like, I saw this fuzzy blanket at Target and thought you would like it, and gave me like, or wanted to give me a fuzzy blanket because of my disability. And like it was, it was like these sort of gestures that were sometimes overt, most of the time were covert
Mhm.
ableism. And it really created a taxing environment on for me. And I eventually had to go to the hospital. And then when I got out of the hospital, I left my internship, which was a good move, but then my program started, there was some problems. And so I've had to navigate challenges as a college student, and I think a lot of students with disabilities feel this way, is that there are many barriers in place for students with disabilities to have to navigate. And that's why I wanted to go into disability services, was to be able to help students navigate those barriers and those systems, and go into this work with like an equity mindset, that you know these barriers are also intersectional. Students may be experiencing things other are more than what they're experiencing related to disability. Like they could, and that they're all connected. And that I
Mhm.
think as a holistic student affairs practitioner, um I hope to be able to support students in a way that they feel like they're valued, and they feel like um that their feelings are valid, heard, and acknowledged. And that, like, I also want to be held accountable for my actions. Like I don't want to be the person that says like, oh, I'll do this, I'll pass this along, and then the student hears nothing from the person again. So
Mhm.
I want to be accountable, and support students, and be an advocate, and not someone who's just going to put up another barrier.
Yeah, I was just gonna ask, like, because you've talked about like you've had to navigate like your college, experience with like um with like your as with academics and all your activities that you've participated in. So like what have you been able to like how have you been able to do that? Like how have you been able to like navigate like because when you're in college, especially a student with a disability, you're trying to figure out how to fit in, and I feel like it's a lot harder for people. So I'm wondering what your experiences was like in that instance.
Yeah, so interestingly, like I was involved in quite a few things in undergrad. Um Most of them I got really involved in after I joined the disability community, but like a lot of them were within my department. So there's pre-veterinary club, and um I was an ambassador for the department, and then I was a part of a Illini Dairy Club. It was like a dairy industry interest group. But for those, it was most of the time I only had the capacity really to be just a member, not really in leadership. And when my interest started shifting towards disability over like veterinary medicine, so I was majoring in animal sciences at Illinois before I decided to go the higher ed route. I mean, I still got a degree in animal sciences, but I changed my focus junior year. And so when I started focusing on disability, I knew I was entering my junior year and classes were getting a little bit harder. And then also during this time, the pandemic started like in March. And
Right.
so with all of this, I didn't really have a lot of spoons to give. And so I picked and chose specific things that I was going to focus on in each organization. So for example, like pre-vet club was my biggest commitment. And so that was being a programs coordinator. We had like 2 major programs that were like shadowing and a wet labs at the vet school. And for those, I needed to be kind of on top of things. And so for that, it was like I relied a lot on my executive board to like just being honest with them when there were some things that I felt like I didn't have the capacity to do. There was always another person who had that capacity, so they helped out a lot. And then I also sort of scheduled in the work like it was also like it was doing schoolwork as well. But with that, I always had another person working with me at similar times. Like I needed to body double essentially with like my specific attention things. Body doubling was really helpful. And so then here in Michigan, when I got to graduate school, I joined a disability advocacy group, and I started joining things that were specific around disability or specific around my like religion, which is Judaism. And so I've only joined groups that I knew I was going to be like active and focused in, and not ones that I would just be like just an email reader essentially. And so that helped with my capacity as well. I had a professor in graduate school say one time that he sees a lot of graduate students sort of fall away from their work because they get so involved and invested in their like voluntary things or their philanthropy. And I think I probably fell into that sort of cycle in grad school as well. It's like now I'm not a grad student, but I'm still active in all of the organizations I was active in as a student. So it's like this weird in between space. But I find that disability spaces especially are one of the more inclusive spaces for me. Though I've heard other people say things about intersectionality being needs to be a big focus, but my space at Michigan is really open and welcoming, and we kind of come as we are in our meetings, so that helps me in terms of navigating the campus world, is like having allies through these groups. Sorry if I'm all over the place.
No, it's good. It's a good answer.
Okay.
So like what sorts of things have you like learned as a college student? You know, like what are some of the lessons that you sort of took away during your time there? And like how do you sort of translate that into your work in the disability community in terms of like helping people with disabilities?
Yeah, so some of the things I've learned are to really like reach out when you feel like you need support, and that I wouldn't make like reach out when you need support, and then I wouldn't be so quick to like judge some of the offices at universities that like may at one point not giving you an answer that you liked, and that I wouldn't be so quick to judge them. A lot of students, for example, might have faced like a barrier at one point getting involved with their disability resource center. But as the disability world is changing and we're shifting from the medical model to the social model, things that students would get denied for example, like if they don't have documentation or something, those aren't as pertinent of points anymore for disability resource centers. Like, especially with this model shift, we're shifting over to how to, the barriers that society puts in place, especially in academia, that create systems that students can't navigate through. And so what we're doing is that we're wanting to support students navigating through those systems. And I think with this whole model shift, it's going to be less documentation based and more based on like the student narrative. So if you're able to advocate for yourself to a point where you can give a narrative, I think that'll be very strong in the future. Let's see. I'm trying to think, like, for me, as a having gone through the interactive process of getting accommodations at the university, and then also going through a second interactive process and getting the same accommodations, but those ones not working for me, those two experiences really helped inform my work as a practitioner, in that I want to work with a student and provide accommodations that I think are reasonable and good for the student, but then also like be able to preface that, hey, these accommodations are not, they're not everything, and that they're going to help you in your college journey, but you have to help yourself as well. And so it's like, as one of my disabilities is ADHD, and one of the accommodations I had was extended deadlines. And while that worked really, really well for me in undergrad, where I was forgetting consistent deadlines over, like, I was forgetting them, or I might have been late, things, and it really helped with that executive function. But when I got to graduate school, that specific accommodation was very problematic for me. Like, I already was having a hard time structuring essays into a way that was like giving me assignments. And then that requires executive function. And then it was writing the essays, and that requires another layer of executive function. And so I was just, doing the thing that a lot of students like to do and procrastinating. And pretty much relying on this accommodation, which professors were more than accommodating for, and then basically digging myself into a hole that I couldn't get out of. And so like that's where I fell short in my that's where I didn't do my part in graduate school. Was I think I relied on this accommodation in a way that like it reduced the stress of writing an essay, but it reduced it to the point where there was no motivation to write the essay. So for those, I would if I could go back, I would have hoped that my access consultant would have given like a sort of contract between that I would have had to make between me and my professor, to where like if I couldn't hold myself accountable, then I would have my professor or my access consultant be there to help push me along. That would have been really helpful. And that's what a lot of universities are doing with that specific accommodation.
Yeah, lastly, you talked about like moving from like from in terms of like accommodations from like a paper-based model to a student narrative model. So like
Mhm.
what kind of blueprint would universities have to have in order to really implement accommodations that suit the students' needs? I don't know if you can speak about that or talk about that.
Yeah, I don't really know, given that I'm not super involved in like the policies behind accommodations, but I have noticed that there's like the shift where narrative is very important. I think it's not going to exclusively be narrative based. I think there's still going to be a documentation layer on there, but I don't think, just in an equity standpoint, offices that are equity minded, I think, are moving away from relying so heavily on documentation that was written 10 years ago or something.
Mm-hmm.
So especially for neurodivergent students, I think so. And then I would say that there's probably going to be a lot of collaboration amongst like this, like there's going to access consultants, I think, are going to like encourage students to be more active in their own process as well. Like something that I liked that I saw in meetings that I was shadowing at an internship, I saw like an access consultant was like offering accommodations that they thought would work for the student, and the student was giving their feedback on them. And then for the ones they were hesitant about, they were giving like sort of conditional accommodation, being like, okay, we can like try this out and see if it works, and if it doesn't work, we don't need it. And so I think that's a really interesting way to go about it, instead of seeing a diagnosis and prescribing these accommodations. Essentially, like I know some
Mm-hmm.
access consultants see ADHD and they're like, okay, time and a half, time and a half, note taking, stuff like that. And that might not entirely be what the student needs. Like I didn't realize when I first got enrolled with disability services that I would have a service dog later, and that service dog was not considered an accommodation that the university could protect. So I had to
Mm-hmm.
like go to the ADA on all of that and like navigate classrooms and laboratories with the service dog per the ADA and not per the Disability Resource Center. So there's still gaps.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are some important points there.